This information is general advice only and does not take into account your objectives, financial situation, and needs. Before making a financial decision based on this advice, you must consider whether it is appropriate in light of your needs, objectives, and financial circumstances, and where relevant, obtain personal, financial, taxation, or legal advice. Where a financial product has been mentioned, you should obtain and read a copy of the product disclosure statement prior to making any decisions.
Hello and welcome to the PKF Podcast. Today I am joined by PKF Wealth's financial advisor, Matthew Weeks. Thank you, Matt, for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be on here.
Yeah, thank you for joining. So today we're going to discuss a bit about super and its foundations. And super is always a very hot topic. What makes it so special?
Well, look, there are a number of aspects in super that makes it very unique, particularly around how it's taxed. So it's by far and away the most tax-effective environment to store wealth. However, there are trade-offs. So, for example, in accumulation phase, concessional contributions are taxed at 15%. However, and so are all the earnings, but unfortunately, you can't access it until you're age 60, for example. So the trade-off is, yes, great tax environment, but unfortunately, you've got a long runway before you can get at it and enjoy the money.
Yeah, okay.
And I guess when it comes to super, while it might be something in the back of your mind, particularly when you're young and accumulating, or you're focused on wealth accumulation outside of super that gives you money today, it is really important to continue to, I guess, make those contributions. You see it in the AFR weekly almost, is how to increase your retirement balance and improve your retirement. And it is really the snowballing effect and compounding of returns is a little bit now counts for a lot down the track. I guess from other tax, when we look at tax outside of, once we've hit age 60 and we can actually get at it, the best thing that I love saying to all my clients is you actually don't have to pay any tax on earnings once you're in pension phase. So that's meeting the conditions of release, being either age 60 and retired, or age 65. You don't necessarily need to be retired. Once you hit age 65, you're usually pretty good to get at it, which is exciting to be able to tell a client we're not paying any more tax on that particular pot of wealth. Usually brings a smile to a client's face, which is always good.
Welcome relief.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess the other really tax-effective aspect is making concessional contributions, which are tax-deductible contributions. So the tax-deductible contribution limit at the moment is $30,000 a year. Mm-hmm. So, for example, if your employer, your SG contributions are $20,000, you can make an additional contribution that's tax-deductible, so it comes off your taxable income, of $10,000. Great. Which is helpful. Obviously, there are more rules the more money you earn, but generally speaking, for the vast majority of the Australian population, that's certainly a good way to A, reduce your taxable income, and B, build wealth in super.
Yeah, great. And you mentioned the pension phase. What does that mean? So
it's not to be confused with the Centrelink age pension. So that's a Centrelink benefit that's available for certain people if they meet the asset test or income test. So that's not necessarily what we say when we say welcome to pension phase to our clients. A lot of clients do get a little bit irked out by the idea of being a pensioner, but it's not being a pensioner, it's actually just being able to optimise your tax position on that pot of wealth. And as I'd alluded to before, it's a tax-free income stream into the home, tax-free on all earnings, up until $2 million is the transfer balance cap. But for the most part, even over $2 million, you're still able to achieve a tax rate that's still lower than any other structure. I guess there are other ways to be able to access the pension. A transition to retirement is something that some of our clients do use. That's being able to say, okay, well, I might be wanting to scale back work, but I still need a certain amount of income to live. A transition to retirement pension does give us, or give that client, an opportunity to have some access to their super to help supplement their living while they're transitioning into full-time retirement.
Yeah, great. Not make the process as...
Yeah, it doesn't make it as daunting.
Yeah.
I mean, retirement is different for everyone, and some people, are absolutely hell-bent on the second they reach age 60, it's tools down and looking forward to kicking the feet up and travelling. And then some people will say they'll never retire, but I guess it's different for everyone, really. It is very much a personal experience on what retirement looks like, but I know a lot of clients like the idea of retiring, putting the tools down, and then I guess what I tend to find is that it's a big transition to go working full-time to then stopping immediately. That hard stop tends to be somewhere where they may even pick up part-time work again. So that transition to retirement kind of lays the foundations for having a successful retirement in terms of staying retired.
Yes, I know a few people that tend to have a bit of trouble staying.
That's right. Staying out of the workforce can be hard because realistically we spend a lot of time working, 30, 40 years, working full time. It is a big transition for clients and people. So definitely a way to make sure that we make sure we do it right the first time.
So Matt, what do you do for clients in regards to the superannuation side of things?
If we look at how I would treat clients in different life stages, and that's kind of the easiest way to group it, is I guess accumulators who are a long way, not really even thinking about retirement. I think it's really good to make sure you're reviewing your investment options inside of super. So is it taking the appropriate amount? Are you taking the appropriate amount of risk? Generally speaking, there is scope to be able to take a little bit more risk in those times because your time horizon for the investment is a lot longer and you can, I guess, afford to take a bit more risk. Over time, historically, markets have, time heals all wounds. So, if there was a market downturn and you're aged 40, chances are by the time you're able to access your super at age 60, it'll probably be in a better position. Then we look at it, well, okay, you're no longer a young accumulator, you're kind of transitioning or preparing yourself for retirement. So that's, between the ages of, say, late 40s to late 50s is when we would say, okay, well, what do we need to do to make sure we've got as much super in, as much wealth in that low tax environment as we can? What are the strategies we need to look at to make sure we can get it in there? And then I guess the other aspect is, okay, well, as we get a little closer to retirement, being a little closer to access that money, maybe we need to look at scaling back some of the risk, because if we do have a market downturn on year one of needing to draw income from it, it's a lot harder to come back from, and that's what we call sequencing risk. Mm-hmm. So that's if we have a bad year one of needing to draw it, it does have a pretty lasting impact on the balance at the end. Yeah. So, ideally, if we can plan around that and take the right amount of risk for what we need to achieve, then we're, in the right spot.
Yeah, great.
And then, obviously, there's the retirees, is we need to make sure the money still lasts, as well as taking the appropriate amount of risk. So I guess that's the trade-off is, well, how much risk do we need to take? We don't need to be achieving, if we only need, say, a 5% income return on an annual basis, then we don't really need to be taking more risk than we need to. It's about just making sure we're adjusting the risk appetite to what the returns goals look like. Yeah. So I've already mentioned conditions of release a little bit, but to be able to access that tax-free income stream that you've worked your whole life essentially to get at, there have to be conditions of release that are met. Age 60 is the typical, the first entry point really to when we're able to access super. That essentially if you're age 60 and you've ceased, you've retired, as well as if you had retired before age 60, so essentially age 60 and not working, you're able to access that income stream tax-free. Equally, you could reach age 65 and still be working full-time, and you're still able to access the income stream. Unfortunately, there are ways to access it earlier, but there are ways that I definitely wouldn't wish on anyone. It's permanent incapacity or terminal illness, essentially. So, they're the ways that you access super, and I guess that's the trade-off that you've got when we say, okay, we're able to load some wealth into a low-tax environment, is we can't really touch it.
I mean, it is an unfortunate topic to discuss, but what does happen to the superannuation benefits upon, the death of someone?
So super is not an estate asset, so it's not handled by your will, and there are certain, I guess, restrictions or conditions that people who are able to be nominated beneficiaries on a death benefit nomination. Death benefit nominations, I guess, to start with, are basically how your super gets directed upon death. Super important to make sure that they're up to date and the nominee or the beneficiary is someone who can receive the money. For example, a spouse, a dependent, or your legal personal representative, which is then at that point going to be dealt with by your will. So that's sending it to the estate to be handled with. When we think about who can't be beneficiaries, it would be an adult children, grandchildren, siblings. Yes, they will still get the benefits, but it's going to come out of the super environment. There'll be a tax on the taxable component of the super balance, which could be 15% if it is 15%, and then there's also a 2% Medicare levy if it goes directly to a person. Whereas if it's dealt with through the legal personal representative or the estate, you do save the 2% on the Medicare. For anyone who's I guess a CIS approved beneficiary, so that's the superannuation, I guess, governing body, as I alluded to, is legal personal representative, spouse, dependent children, or I guess any dependents, and that kind of, it is a very small group of people that can receive the benefits inside the super system. There are a number of people that can get benefits, but it's not going to stay in the tax-free system. It'll have to come out of the super system and be dealt with that way. Got to pay the tax and keep it moving.
So we obviously discussed the super benefits and what happens upon death, but how can someone prepare for that? Yeah,
so great question. So I guess when we can always be prepared, and I guess our philosophy is prepare for the worst and hope for the best. So making sure that our death benefit nominations are in place with our superannuation provider, and there's a few nominations that can be made in terms of the types of death benefit nominations. So a non-lapsing is, as the name implies, is a non-lapsing nomination. That's not necessarily binding though. So because super's not an estate asset, it can actually be, it can be at the discretion of the trustee. So if you didn't have a nomination, the super provider is able to determine whether or not it gets paid to 3 children equally, or maybe a new de facto partner or something like that. So essentially it can come without direction, without a death benefit nomination. The super provider, the trustee, is able to determine where that death benefit goes to, and whether or not that's what the wishes of the person are. That's a whole different question. So a non-lapsing death benefit nomination essentially means that it's not lapsing, but it's not necessarily binding. It all comes down to each super provider's interpretation of that. Then there's what we call a binding death benefit nomination. So the super provider is bound to follow those instructions, and they usually require a 3-year renewal. So that's definitely something that if you want a certain outcome, a binding death benefit nomination is absolutely probably the way to go. And then I guess the other option would be putting in no nomination, which is, I guess, the worst case scenario, and that leaves you exposed to, or leaves you at the discretion of the trustee, which is not necessarily the right outcome. In terms of beneficiaries, I've mentioned that your legal personal representative is typically a very safe bet. While it's probably not the most tax effective if you've got a spouse, if there's no one else, then typically a legal personal representative is the best outcome for a death benefit nomination.
Let's try and summarise a little bit here. What are some of the things that someone could do to ensure that they're getting the best outcome?
Yep. So continue to contribute. If you can make more contributions and your cash flow allows, then do it. Even a little bit goes a long way when you're young. That's probably the number one thing that you'd consider, because as I'd mentioned before, compounding counts for a lot, and that snowball, the bigger the snowball you start with, the bigger it gets at the bottom of the hill, which the bottom of the hill being retirement. So everyone's, I think for the most part, goals are to have a nice big snowball and a comfortable retirement at the bottom of the hill. So that's probably number one. Number two would be making sure you're invested in something that's aligned with your risk profile and your time horizon. They're the things you need to give consideration to. And make sure you're reviewing your death benefit nominations. If you do have a life event that changes, a separation, a marriage, a new de facto partner, children, anything like that, where your circumstances in life have changed considerably, update your death benefit nominations and make sure they're still valid and in place. And that's probably the few really high-level key things that you need to think about, certainly in that accumulation phase for sure.
Perfect. Well, Matt, really appreciate you joining us on the podcast today, and your insights into super and all of that have been very beneficial, and I will know that will be the same for our viewers as well. Thank you, and thank you for joining us on the podcast today. If you want to get in touch with Matt, you can find him with the PKF Wealth team, and thank you for listening.